Tonight we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then passed quietly into the historical record, a case that has never been formally solved. A single investigation, a single verdict of murder by persons unknown, and a question that has never received an answer. The case of Caroline Mary Luard begins in Kent in the summer of 1908. Kent at this time was a county of market towns, orchards, and hop gardens, situated within easy reach of London by rail, yet retaining the character of a settled agricultural district. The village of Ightham, near which the Luards made their home, lay among wooded hills and narrow lanes in the western part of the county, a landscape of small farms, gentlemen's estates, and parish churches dating to the medieval period. The area was known locally for Ightham Moat, a historic moated manor house associated with the Luard family name, though Caroline and her husband did not themselves reside there. Their home was Ightham Knoll, a smaller though still substantial residence set within its own grounds, appropriate to the standing of a retired military officer and his family. By 1908, Edwardian England had settled into a period of outward stability, though beneath that stability ran currents of social change that would, within a few years, be swept aside entirely by war. The class of retired officers, magistrates, and landed gentry to which the Luards belonged occupied a particular place within this society, one defined by service, property, and a network of local obligation and courtesy. Neighbouring families extended to one another privileges such as the right to walk across each other's land, to make use of garden buildings, and to exchange visits on terms of established familiarity. It was under such an arrangement that the Luards had standing permission to walk upon the grounds of Frankfield House, an estate belonging to the Wilkinson family and lying near Seal Chart, within which stood a wooden summer house, known locally as La Casa. The countryside around Ightham in August of that year would have presented itself in the full growth of late summer, its woods dense with foliage, its lanes dry and hedged, its fields recently or soon to be harvested. The parish supported a population engaged largely in agriculture and in service to the larger houses of the district, together with tradesmen, clergy, and a resident constabulary sufficient for a rural county of its size. Golf had become a popular recreation among the professional and gentry classes of the period, and a course existed within walking distance of Ightham Knoll, one that Charles Luard, Caroline's husband, was in the habit of visiting. It was into this ordinary settled world, a world of walking parties, garden calls, and quiet afternoons, that the events of the 24th of August 1908 intruded without warning. Caroline Mary Hartley was born in the last quarter of 1850 at Guildford, near Egremont, in the county of Cumberland, in the northwest of England. She was the youngest daughter of Thomas Hartley, a magistrate who served as a justice of the peace within the county, and his wife Georgiana Elizabeth Rimington Hartley. Thomas Hartley died when Caroline was approximately 5 years of age, leaving her mother to raise the family. The surviving documentary record does not preserve further detail of Caroline's childhood, her education, or the particular circumstances of her upbringing following her father's death. What can be stated with confidence is that she was born into a family of established local standing, one in which her father's position as a magistrate placed the household among the recognised gentry of the district, a status that would continue to define Caroline's life in the years that followed. On the 1st of July 1875, at the age of 24, Caroline Hartley married Charles Edward Luard. Charles Luard was an army officer, the son of Robert Luard, whose family held long-standing associations with Ightham Moat in Kent. Charles pursued a career in military service that would eventually see him attain the rank of Major General, and following his retirement from active duty, he took up the position of magistrate within the local district, continuing in this respect the pattern of public service that had characterised Caroline's own family. The marriage established the couple within the settled community of Ightham, where they took up residence at Ightham Knoll and began to raise a family. 2 sons were born to Charles and Caroline Luard. The elder, Charles Elmhurst Luard, was born in 1876. The younger, Edward Dalbiac Luard, was born in 1878. Both sons pursued careers connected to military and imperial service, in keeping with the expectations placed upon young men of their class and background during this period. Edward Dalbiac Luard served on active duty in Somaliland, where he died in 1903, 5 years before the events that would take his mother's life. Charles Elmhurst Luard remained in military service and would go on to be awarded the Distinguished Service Order, though he too would not survive to old age. He was killed in action at Missy Seraing in the opening weeks of the First World War in 1914, 6 years after his mother's death and roughly a decade after his brother's. By the summer of 1908, therefore, Charles and Caroline Luard were living together at Ightham Knoll without either of their sons present in the household, Edward having died 5 years earlier and Charles Elmhurst being engaged in his own military career at a distance. The couple's circumstances at this time reflected the ordinary pattern of an established professional family whose adult children had moved into their own lives and postings. No record survives of any financial difficulty affecting the household, nor of any dispute, scandal, or irregularity attaching to either Charles or Caroline Luard prior to the events of August 1908. The couple were known within the district as respectable and settled members of the local gentry, on visiting terms with neighbouring families including the Wilkinsons of Frankfield House, and with local figures of standing such as the Reverend A.B. Cotton and Colonel Charles Ward, who at this time sat as the local Member of Parliament. If value is found in cases preserved through court records, testimony, and the surviving documents of the period, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let those following along note in the comments where they are watching from. What follows begins in Kent in the summer of 1908. The events leading to Caroline Luard's death began as an ordinary afternoon within an ordinary household routine. On Monday, the 24th of August 1908, Charles and Caroline Luard left Ightham Knoll together at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, accompanied by the family dog, for what appears to have been a customary walk across the surrounding countryside. The couple made use, as they habitually did, of the standing permission granted to them by the Wilkinson family to walk upon the grounds of the neighbouring Frankfield estate. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that this outing differed in any respect from walks the couple had taken together on many previous occasions. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Charles and Caroline Luard parted company at a wicket gate on the estate grounds. The arrangement appears to have been an informal one, consistent with a couple accustomed to pursuing separate errands during the course of a shared walk, before rejoining one another at home. Charles Luard continued on in the direction of the golf links, where he had evidently intended to occupy himself, while Caroline turned back toward a wooden summer house, known as La Casa, situated within the wooded grounds of the Frankfield estate near Seal Chart. This summer house, with its veranda facing out into the surrounding woodland, was a modest structure of the kind commonly found on larger estates of the period, intended for rest or shelter during walks across the grounds. The movements of Charles Luard following his separation from his wife would later become a matter of considerable significance to the investigation, and they were reconstructed afterward in close and exacting detail through the accounts of several independent witnesses. A local man named Thomas Durand later stated that he had observed Charles Luard at Hall Farm at approximately 3:15, placing him at a location some distance from the summer house, at a time closely following his separation from Caroline. Further sightings placed him in the vicinity of the golf links some minutes afterward, and he was subsequently seen by the steward of the golf club at approximately 25 minutes to 4. At approximately 5 minutes past 4, Charles Luard encountered the Reverend A.B. Cotton, the local vicar, who accompanied him back toward Ightham Knoll, delivering him to the house at approximately 20 to 25 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. Caroline Luard did not return home at the expected hour. Charles Luard, having arrived back at Ightham Knoll in the mid-afternoon, began to search for his wife, when it became apparent that she had not yet returned from their walk. This search commenced at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, and continued for a period of roughly 3/4 of an hour, during which time Charles Luard retraced portions of the route the couple had walked together earlier that day. The family dog, which had accompanied the couple on their outing and had evidently remained in the vicinity of the summer house, is recorded as having played a part in leading Charles Luard toward the location where his wife was ultimately found. At approximately 5:15 in the afternoon, Charles Luard discovered his wife's body upon the veranda of the summer house known as La Casa. Caroline Luard had been shot. She had sustained gunshot wounds to the head, and the circumstances in which she was found indicated that death had come rapidly and at close quarters. One of her gloves had been removed, and rings had been taken from that hand, and her purse, together with a torn pocket from her dress, indicated some manner of disturbance to her person, though the surviving record does not permit certainty as to whether this reflected genuine robbery or an attempt to present the appearance of one. 2 residents of the district, Annie Wickham, the wife of a coachman living near Frankfield House, and a gardener named Daniel Kettle, later gave evidence that they had heard shots fired in the vicinity of the summer house at a time consistent with the period during which Caroline Luard was killed, though neither had at the time understood the significance of what they had heard. The discovery of Caroline Luard's body brought to an abrupt end what had, until that point, been an entirely unremarkable afternoon within a settled and respectable household. The interval between the moment at which husband and wife parted at the wicket gate and the moment at which her body was found spanned little more than 2 hours, during which time Charles Luard's own movements were later established through the corroborating testimony of several witnesses who had encountered him at various points along a route that placed him at a demonstrable distance from the summer house during the period in which the shooting was determined to have occurred. The investigation that followed would come to rest heavily upon this reconstructed timeline, and upon the question of who, in the absence of any established connection between Caroline Luard and a known assailant, might have had occasion to take her life upon the veranda of a summer house. She had visited many times before, without incident. The investigation into the death of Caroline Luard was formally opened within hours of the discovery of her body, and officers of the Kent Constabulary were dispatched to the scene at Frankfield Estate before nightfall on the 24th of August. Given the gravity of the case and the standing of the family involved, the local force soon sought the assistance of Scotland Yard, and detectives from London joined the investigation within days of the murder. The area surrounding the summer house was examined for physical evidence, and statements were taken from the various residents and estate workers who'd been in the vicinity of Seal Chart during the afternoon in question. Investigators worked to establish a precise chronology of the hours preceding and following the shooting, a task made considerably more exacting by the rural and wooded character of the ground, which offered few natural witnesses to any single point along the paths that crossed it. Bloodhounds named Scepter and Solferino, brought to Kent from Stratford-upon-Avon by their owner, Major Richardson, were employed in an effort to trace the movements of whoever had been present at the summer house at the time of the shooting. The dogs were set to work upon the ground surrounding La Casa in the days following the murder, though the passage of time and the number of persons who had already crossed the estate in search of Caroline Luard, and in the course of the initial investigation, had by then compromised much of the scent that might otherwise have been followed. The use of tracking dogs in a case of this kind was itself a matter of considerable public interest, and their deployment was reported at length in the contemporary press as an indication of the seriousness with which the investigation was being pursued. Firearms examination formed a significant part of the investigative effort. Edwin Churchill, a recognised expert in matters of ballistics and firearms, examined the bullets recovered from Caroline Luard's body and determined that they had been fired from a revolver of .320 caliber. This finding assumed particular importance because Charles Luard was known to own 3 revolvers, and each of these weapons was examined and found to be of a different caliber than the one indicated by Churchill's analysis. The firearms evidence therefore stood in direct contradiction to any theory that the fatal shots had been fired from a weapon in Charles Luard's own possession, a conclusion that weighed materially against any suspicion that might otherwise have attached to him. Detective Inspector Jarvis, among the officers assigned to the case, pursued at least one line of inquiry that extended as far as Winnipeg in Canada. Her undertaking that reflects the geographic breadth investigators were prepared to cover in seeking any thread that might lead to the identity of the person responsible. The precise nature of this inquiry, and what, if anything, it yielded, is not preserved in the surviving record with sufficient clarity to state further. A reward of £1,000 was offered for information leading to the identification of the person or persons responsible for Caroline Luard's death, a substantial sum for the period, and a further indication of the priority placed upon resolving the case. Investigators devoted considerable attention to the question of whether Caroline Luard had received any communication that might have drawn her to the summer house, or whether her presence there on the afternoon of the 24th of August had been, as it appeared, a matter of simple habit and convenience during an ordinary walk. No evidence was found of any letter or appointment that could account for her presence at La Casa, beyond the fact that the summer house lay along a route she and her husband were known to walk together. The absence of any such evidence left investigators with a killing that appeared on the available evidence to have arisen either from chance encounter or from a degree of premeditation that had left no trace in the form of correspondence, threat, or prior dispute involving Caroline Luard herself. The taking of statements extended to a considerable number of residents of the district, including domestic staff employed at Ightham Knoll and at Frankfield House, tradesmen who had occasion to pass through the area, and other individuals who'd been walking or working within the vicinity of Sealchart during the afternoon of the murder. Each statement was recorded and weighed against the developing chronology of the day, and particular attention was given to corroborating or challenging the account of Charles Luard's own movements following his separation from his wife at the Wicket Gate. The consistency of the independent sightings of Charles Luard, each placing him at successive points along a route leading away from the summer house during the period in which the shooting occurred, was treated by investigators as significant evidence bearing upon his position in the case. A post-mortem examination of Caroline Luard's body was conducted by Dr. Mansfield, a physician called to the case in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. Dr. Mansfield's examination established that death had resulted from gunshot wounds to the head, delivered at very close range, and that the injuries sustained were sufficient to have caused death within a short time of the shots being fired. The examination further indicated that Caroline Luard had suffered a blow or fall prior to the final shots, consistent with an initial act of violence that preceded the fatal injury, and evidence of vomiting was noted, consistent with the body having undergone a violent assault. Dr. Mansfield's findings were entered into the record and formed the basis for the medical evidence subsequently presented to the coroner. The inquest into the death of Caroline Luard opened on the 26th of August 1908, only 2 days after her body had been discovered, convened initially at Ightham Knoll itself before the coroner. Given the scale of public and press interest the case had already attracted, the inquest was adjourned and resumed a fortnight later at the George and Dragon Inn in Ightham, a public house that served, as was common practice for rural inquests of the period, as a venue large enough to accommodate the coroner, the jury, and the witnesses called to give evidence. The proceedings at this resumed hearing addressed the findings of the post-mortem examination, the evidence of the witnesses who had heard shots fired near the summer house, and the account of Charles Luard's own movements during the afternoon of his wife's death. During the resumed inquest, the coroner put to Charles Luard a direct question, asking whether he was aware of any incident in the life of his wife, or in his own life, that might have caused any person to hold feelings of revenge or jealousy toward her. Charles Luard answered that he was aware of no such incident. He was further asked whether his wife had received any letter or communication that might have drawn her to the summer house on the day of her death, and he stated that she had not. His testimony at the inquest was consistent throughout with the account of his movements that had already been corroborated by the independent witnesses who had observed him at various points along his route that afternoon. Having heard the evidence of the post-mortem examination, the testimony of the witnesses who reported hearing shots near La Casa, and the account given by Charles Luard of his own movements and of his ignorance of any motive that might explain the killing, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. No individual was named, charged, or committed for trial in connection with Caroline Luard's death. The inquest closed with the case formally unresolved, the identity of whoever had fired the shots that killed her remaining, on the evidence presented, entirely unknown to the court. In the weeks that followed the conclusion of the inquest, a change began to settle over the district surrounding Ightham, one that had nothing to do with the official findings of the investigation and everything to do with the private conversations of those who lived within it. Rumour began to circulate concerning Charles Luard's own possible involvement in his wife's death, despite the absence of any evidence connecting him to the crime, and despite the corroborated timeline that had placed him elsewhere during the period in which the shooting occurred. The rumours took contradictory forms, some suggesting that Caroline Luard had taken a lover whose identity Charles had discovered, others suggesting instead that Charles himself had been unfaithful and that his visits to the golf links had served as a cover for some other purpose. A local woman named Rose Miles was later identified as among those who'd given voice to claims of this kind within the neighbourhood. Anonymous letters began arriving at Ightham Knoll in the aftermath of the inquest. Letters that a friend of Charles Luard, Bertram Winifrith, would later describe as vile in their content and accusatory in their substance, some of them bearing a local postmark that indicated they had originated from within the immediate district rather than from any stranger at a distance. These letters accused Charles Luard in terms that have not survived in the documentary record beyond Winifrith's characterization of them, of responsibility for his wife's murder. The arrival of such correspondence addressed to a man who had lost his wife to a killing he had played no established part in, and who had by that point endured weeks of public speculation, conducted largely outside any formal legal process, placed upon him a burden separate from, and in some respects, heavier than the original tragedy itself. By the middle of September 1908, the pressure of this sustained and unfounded suspicion had become evident to those closest to Charles Luard. On the 17th of September, he travelled to stay as a guest at the home of Colonel Charles Ward, the local Member of Parliament and brother of Kent's Chief Constable. Henry Ward, apparently seeking some measure of support and respite from the atmosphere that had settled over Ightham in the week since the inquest. He remained at Colonel Ward's home overnight. The following morning, the 18th of September 1908, Charles Luard left the house and made his way toward the railway line near the village of Teston. At approximately 9:09 that morning, Charles Luard stepped into the path of a train travelling from Maidstone West toward Tunbridge and was killed instantly. A note was found pinned to his clothing, addressed to whoever might discover him, asking that he be taken to Colonel Ward. A further letter, written in his own hand, attributed his action directly to what he described as the horrid letters, which he stated he had destroyed, and to the insinuations that had been made against him in the weeks following his wife's death. The verdict recorded in connection with his death was suicide, while temporarily insane. It fell to Colonel Ward to convey the news of Charles Luard's death to the surviving members of the family and to the wider circle of friends and connections who had known the couple. The Maidstone and Kentish Journal, reporting on the events of that September, observed that 2 murders had in effect been committed in Kent within the span of a single month, one victim killed with a pistol, and the other, in the newspaper's phrase, killed with a pen. The remark captured a sentiment that circulated widely in the local and national press at the time, namely that Charles Luard, a man against whom no evidence had ever been produced, and whose movements on the day of his wife's death had been independently corroborated by multiple witnesses, had nonetheless been driven to his death by accusations pursued entirely outside the formal processes of law. No inquiry, arrest, or judicial proceeding had ever named him as a suspect with any standing, in fact. The rumour and the anonymous correspondence that reached Ightham Knoll in the weeks after the inquest had accomplished what the investigation itself had not, in bringing about the end of a second life connected to the case within a single month of the first. In the years that followed, the case of Caroline Luard's murder remained without resolution, and in the absence of any confirmed suspect, later writers and investigators returned to the file in search of explanations that the original inquiry had not produced. One theory, advanced some years afterward by Sir Sidney Orme Rowan Hamilton, who later served as Chief Justice of Bermuda, connected the killing to a man named John Alexander Dickman. Dickman was convicted and hanged in August 1910 for the murder of a colliery cashier named John Innes Nisbet, a crime committed aboard a train near Morpeth in Northumberland, several hundred miles to the north of Kent, and separated from the Luard case by no established evidentiary connection beyond the theory itself. Rowan Hamilton's account held that Caroline Luard had responded to a newspaper advertisement placed by Dickman seeking financial assistance, that she had sent him a cheque, that the cheque had been altered, and that she had been killed after discovering the alteration. This theory has never been substantiated by evidence placing Dickman in Kent at the time of Caroline Luard's death, and it is presented in the historical record as a later and unproven speculation rather than as an established account of events. It is also noted that 5 members of the jury that convicted Dickman of the Nisbet murder later signed a petition questioning the safety of that conviction, a fact that has done little to strengthen confidence in extending his guilt to a second and geographically distant case. A further and considerably more recent theory, advanced in 2014, proposed a connection to Teresa Wilkinson, a member of the family that owned Frankfield House, and the summer house in which Caroline Luard was killed. This theory rests on comparatively thin foundation within the available record and has not achieved the degree of attention given to the Dickman theory, though it continues to circulate among those with an interest in the case. The case of Caroline Luard has continued to occupy a place within British true crime writing across more than a century since her death. The writer Julian Simons examined the case at length in his 1960 study, A Reasonable Doubt, treating it as one of the notable, unsolved crimes of the Edwardian period. The connection proposed between the murder and John Alexander Dickman was itself given its fullest early treatment in Rowan Hamilton's 1914 account of the Dickman trial, a work that helped fix that theory within the wider literature on the case even as its evidentiary basis remained contested. A more recent full-length study, Diane James's Edwardian Murder, published in 2007, examined both the Luard case and the Morpeth train robbery, connected to Dickman within a single volume, weighing the strength of the proposed connection between the two. The case has also found its way into fiction, most notably in Minette Walters's 2013 novella A Dreadful Murder, which drew upon the documented events at Ightham for its narrative. Television treatment came in October 1996, when the case was featured as an episode of the series In Suspicious Circumstances, presenting a dramatised account of the murder and the investigation that followed. Regional press in Kent has continued to revisit the case periodically in the decades since, a testament to its continued standing as a subject of local historical interest within the county where it occurred. The murder of Caroline Luard has endured within British historical memory, chiefly as an example of an unsolved country house crime of the Edwardian period, a case in which the ordinary rhythms of gentry life, walking parties, garden visits, golf links, and summer houses were interrupted by a violence that was never traced to its source. It has also come to serve, in the manner it is most often discussed by later writers, as an illustration of the damage that can be inflicted by rumour and anonymous accusation operating entirely outside the formal boundaries of law. Charles Luard was never charged with any offence, and the evidence gathered in the course of the official investigation, from the corroborated timeline of his movements to the mismatch between the calibre of his own revolvers and the weapon used in the killing, weighed consistently against any suspicion of his involvement. Yet it was precisely this unresolved uncertainty, the absence of any named and convicted party, that created the conditions under which local gossip was able to attach itself to him with such consequence. The case also reflects something of the particular character of Edwardian society and its relationship to crime committed within its own ranks. A murder involving a family of established local standing, a magistrate's household, drew a scale of national press attention and official resource, from Scotland Yard detectives to trained bloodhounds, to a substantial reward that was rarely extended to violence occurring among the poorer residents of the same county. The killing of Caroline Luard was treated from its earliest hours as a crime demanding the fullest resources available to the investigating authorities, and the case remains, in the absence of any resolution, a permanent entry in the record of English criminal history as a murder that was thoroughly investigated and never solved. The scale of attention drawn to Caroline Luard's murder can be measured in part by the volume of correspondence the investigation itself received from members of the public in the weeks following the killing. Letters arrived at the Kent Constabulary and at Scotland Yard offering theories, naming suspects, and in some instances claiming direct knowledge of the crime, a flood of communication that investigators were obliged to sift and weigh alongside the evidence gathered through more conventional means. National newspapers carried daily reports on the progress of the investigation throughout the final week of August and into September of 1908, a level of sustained coverage rarely afforded to crimes outside London itself, and one that reflected both the standing of the Luard family within Kent society and the unusual and unresolved nature of the killing itself. The reward of £1,000 offered for information represented a sum equivalent to several years' wages for a working man of the period, and its scale was itself widely reported as an indication of the seriousness with which the authorities regarded the case. Despite this inducement, no information was ever produced that led to the identification of a suspect, a fact that contributed in its own right to the growing sense, both within the immediate district and in the wider public understanding of the case, that the killing might never be resolved through ordinary investigative means. The failure of the reward to produce a credible lead stood in contrast to its success in other prominent cases of the period, and later commentators have pointed to this absence of response as evidence that whoever was responsible for Caroline Luard's death left behind no network of acquaintance or complicity through which information might ordinarily have surfaced. The Kent Constabulary of 1908 was a comparatively small force, responsible for policing a largely rural county with limited manpower relative to the geographic area under its jurisdiction, a circumstance that made the assistance of Scotland Yard detectives, dispatched from London within days of the killing, a practical necessity rather than merely a formality. The cooperation between the county force and the metropolitan detectives sent to assist them reflected an arrangement increasingly common in serious provincial cases of the period, in which local knowledge of the district and its residents was combined with the specialised investigative experience of officers accustomed to working major crimes. This combination of resources notwithstanding, the case would ultimately join a small number of prominent unsolved killings from the Edwardian period, whose files remained open, notionally, for decades after the events themselves. Their investigating officers long since retired or deceased, the physical evidence gathered in 1908, preserved but never again matched to a name. The summer house known as La Casa remained standing on the Frankfield estate for many years following the murder, and for a time it served as an object of particular local fascination, a modest wooden structure that visitors to the district would seek out on account of the events that had taken place upon its veranda. The estate itself passed through the ordinary changes of ownership and management that affected many such properties across the 20th century, and the precise fate of the building in later decades is not established with the same certainty as the events of 1908 themselves, though its location near Seal Chart has continued to be identified in regional accounts of the case. Itham Knoll, the Luard's own residence, likewise continued to stand within the district long after the family's connection to it ended, a private house whose association with the murder has persisted within local memory independent of whatever subsequent occupants it may have had. The centenary of Caroline Luard's death, falling in August of 2008, occasioned a renewed round of attention to the case within the Kent regional press, with retrospective articles examining the murder, the investigation, and the death of Charles Luard some 3 weeks later, drawing once again upon the same body of inquest testimony, witness statements, and press archives that had informed accounts of the case since 1908 itself. Such anniversary treatments have tended to return to the same central facts: the corroborated timeline of Charles Luard's movements, the mismatch in revolver caliber, the verdict of murder by persons unknown, without adding new evidence to the historical record, a reflection of the fact that no further material bearing directly on the identity of the killer has come to light in the century, and more, since the crime was committed. The case file itself, preserved among the records of the period, stands as a rare instance of an Edwardian murder investigation conducted with the full resources available to the authorities of the day, resulting nonetheless in an inquest verdict that named no one, a file that has been consulted, cited, and revisited many times since, without ever being closed by an arrest. The deaths of both of Caroline and Charles Luard's sons in the years surrounding their parents' own deaths brought about the effective end of the family's direct line within Kent, a fact noted by several of the writers who later examined the case in the context of the wider tragedy that had befallen the household. Edward Dalbiac Luard, who died in Somaliland in 1903, was laid to rest far from the family home, in keeping with the ordinary circumstance of a young officer who died while serving overseas. Charles Elmhurst Luard, the elder son, was killed at Missy Serain in the early weeks of the First World War. In September 1914, one of the many thousands of British officers lost in the opening engagements of that conflict along the Ain River, his death coming just over 6 years after his mother had been shot on the veranda of a summer house he had likely visited as a boy. His award of the Distinguished Service Order recognised service rendered prior to his death, and his name, together with those of his fellow officers lost in the same campaign, was entered into the military records of the period in the manner customary for a serving officer killed in action. With both sons dead and their parents gone within the space of little more than a decade, the direct Luard family line connected to Itham Knoll came to an end, and whatever personal effects, correspondence, or papers had remained within the household passed, in the ordinary course of such matters, out of family hands and into the more scattered condition in which historical researchers would later find them. The Wikipedia entry devoted to Caroline Luard, together with the parallel entry devoted to the murder itself, draws upon this dispersed body of surviving material, from inquest testimony to press archives to the later published accounts of Simons, Rowan Hamilton, and Janes, to reconstruct as complete a record of the case as now exists. No family member survived to provide a first-hand account of these events for the historical record beyond what was said at the time, in testimony given before the coroner, and in the brief public statements attributed to those closest to the couple, statements that remain, more than a century later, the fullest surviving expression of what those who knew Caroline and Charles Luard understood of the tragedy that overtook them. The surviving documents connected to the case, including the inquest depositions, witness statements, and correspondence generated during the investigation, have in the years since been consulted by researchers working within the archives maintained in Kent, where records of county coroners' inquests and constabulary files from the early 20th century are preserved for historical and genealogical purposes. Contemporary newspaper coverage of the case, spanning the national dailies as well as regional titles such as the Maidstone and Kentish Journal, has likewise been preserved in library and archive collections and has served as a principal source for every subsequent published account of the murder, from Simon's 1960 study through to the more recent treatments by Janes and by regional historians writing for local publications. The absence of a surviving suspect or a resolved prosecution has meant that no trial transcript exists for the case, a further factor that has shaped the way researchers have approached it, relying instead upon the inquest record and the parallel investigative files maintained by the Kent Constabulary and by Scotland Yard. The figure of Henry Ward, Chief Constable of Kent at the time of the murder and brother to the Colonel Ward at whose house Charles Luard spent his final night, occupied a position of particular difficulty within the unfolding events, standing at the head of the very force charged with investigating a case in which his own brother's guest would take his life, amid unproven suspicion before any resolution had been reached. Henry Ward's official responsibilities placed him at the centre of the investigative effort throughout the weeks following Caroline Luard's death, overseeing the work of the local constabulary as it coordinated with the detectives sent from London, even as members of his own immediate family circle found themselves drawn personally into the aftermath of the case through Colonel Ward's hospitality toward Charles Luard in the days before his death. This convergence of official duty and personal connection within a single family was not unusual for a county the size of Kent, where the class of magistrates, military officers, and public officials from which both the Luards and the Wards were drawn remained comparatively small and closely interconnected across successive generations of local governance. Domestic staff employed at Ightham Knoll were among those called upon to provide statements in the course of the investigation, offering accounts of the household's ordinary routine and of Caroline Luard's habits in the days and weeks preceding her death. These statements described a settled domestic pattern typical of a household of its class and size, one organised around regular hours, established duties and the quiet rhythm of a couple whose children had grown and departed, leaving husband and wife to occupy the greater part of their days together, or in the company of the small staff retained to manage the house and grounds. Nothing in the accounts given by these servants indicated any disturbance to this pattern in the period immediately before the murder. No unusual visitors, no altered habits, no sign that Caroline Luard had departed in any way from her customary conduct in the days leading up to the walk that ended at the summer house on the Frankfield estate. The scale of press interest in the case extended to the dispatch of special correspondence from several London papers to Ightham itself in the days following the murder, journalists who took up temporary lodging within the village and the surrounding district in order to file daily reports on the progress of the investigation and the proceedings of the inquest. Their presence within so small a rural community represented an intrusion of a kind not previously experienced by many of its residents. And accounts from the period describe crowds gathering outside the George and Dragon Inn during the resumed inquest hearing, drawn by curiosity toward a case that had, within a matter of days, transformed a quiet Kentish village into a subject of national attention. The volume of this coverage did not diminish materially in the weeks following the verdict of murder by persons unknown, sustained instead by the subsequent death of Charles Luard, an event that renewed press attention to the case with an intensity comparable to that which had greeted the original murder itself. Coverage of Charles Luard's death carried its own distinct character within the press of the period, distinguished from the reporting of the original murder by an evident undertone of reflection upon the conduct of the newspapers themselves in the weeks between the two events. Several publications, in reporting the circumstances of his death near Teston, acknowledged in general terms the atmosphere of suspicion that had built around him since the inquest, without directly attributing responsibility for that atmosphere to their own columns. The specific line attributed to the Maidstone and Kentish Journal, framing the two deaths as a single month's twin murders, one by pistol and one by pen, was reproduced in other regional and national papers in the days following Charles Luard's death, becoming, in effect, the phrase by which the press of the period most often summarised the connection between the two tragedies for their readers. The inquest into Charles Luard's own death was convened separately from that held for his wife, addressing the specific circumstances of his final movements from Colonel Ward's house to the railway line near Teston, the note pinned to his clothing, and the letter in which he set down his own account of the pressures that had driven him to take his life. The jury at this second inquest heard evidence establishing the manner and circumstances of his death and returned the verdict of suicide while temporarily insane, a formulation commonly applied in inquests of the period where a jury wished to record the fact of self-inflicted death while attributing the act to disturbance of mind rather than to settled intention, a distinction that carried consequences for matters such as burial rites within the practice of the period. This distinction carried practical weight within the parish itself, and Charles Luard's burial proceeded according to the rites customary for such a verdict, conducted quietly and without the fuller ceremony that had attended Caroline Luard's own funeral 3 weeks earlier. Caroline Luard's funeral had drawn a wide gathering from across the district, neighbouring families, fellow magistrates, tenants, and estate workers from Frankfield and the surrounding properties, and representatives of the local clergy assembling at the parish church to mark the death of a woman who had, within the settled society of Ightham, occupied a position of long-standing and quiet respect. Wreaths and floral tributes arrived from households across the county in the days following her death, a customary expression of condolence among the gentry of the period, and newspaper accounts of the funeral itself noted the scale of attendance as a further measure of the standing the Luard family held within Kent society. By contrast, the funeral held for Charles Luard some 3 weeks later proceeded under circumstances markedly altered by the events of the intervening weeks. Those who had known him faced the particular difficulty of mourning a man whose death had followed so closely upon a period of public suspicion that had never been resolved in his favour by any formal exoneration, notwithstanding the corroborated evidence of his movements on the day of the murder. Bertram Winifrith, who had described the anonymous letters reaching Ightham Knoll in the weeks after the inquest, was among those who spoke afterward of the change that had come over Charles Luard in the final days of his life, an alteration attributed by those who observed it to the sustained strain of accusation borne without any means of formal legal redress, since no charge had ever been laid against him that he might answer or be cleared of through the ordinary processes of a court. The absence of any such formal accusation left Charles Luard in a position his friends later described as peculiarly difficult, a man publicly suspected within his own community, yet never afforded the opportunity to contest that suspicion before a court of law, since suspicion conveyed through anonymous letters and private rumour offered no forum in which it might be answered or disproved. This circumstance, more than any single piece of evidence, has been identified by later writers examining the case as the central mechanism by which an innocent man, cleared in every particular by the investigation conducted against him, came nonetheless to take his own life within a month of his wife's murder, a sequence of cause and consequence that the historical record preserves in full, even as it withholds any answer to the question of who was actually responsible for the killing that set these events in motion. The investigation into the death of Caroline Luard was formally concluded without an arrest, and the case was entered into the historical record as unresolved. No suspect was ever charged. The record remained as it stood, the case just finished as closed. We turn now to a second record, drawn from a different corner of the country and a different decade, one far less remembered than the first, concerning a young woman whose evening began in the ordinary manner of a Sunday and ended in a place built for passage rather than for stillness. It turns upon the same unanswered question that closed the previous file. What happened to her, and who, if anyone, was present when it did? The case of Mary Sophia Money begins in Merstham, Surrey, in the early autumn of 1905. Merstham was, at that date, a village of the North Downs, situated along the London to Brighton railway line, a place known chiefly for its chalk quarries, its limeworks, and the long tunnel that carried trains beneath the ridge of the Downs to the south of the village itself. The tunnel had been constructed decades earlier as part of the expansion of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, and by 1905 it was an unremarkable feature of a well-established line, one of thousands of such tunnels across the country through which trains passed daily without incident. The wider railway network of which it formed a part had by this date become an entirely ordinary feature of English life, carrying commuters, tradesmen and travellers of every description between London and the towns of the south coast, at all hours and in all weathers. Clapham Junction, some miles to the north, was by 1905 among the busiest railway junctions in the world, a vast interchange of platforms and lines serving the southern and southwestern railway companies, through which tens of thousands of passengers passed on an ordinary day. The district surrounding the junction, Battersea, and the wider area south of the river had grown rapidly across the preceding decades from semi-rural outskirts into a dense urban expanse of terraced housing, small businesses, and light industry, populated largely by clerks, tradesmen, and workers employed in the trades that served the railway and the growing suburbs around it. Lavender Hill, a thoroughfare running through this district, was lined with shops and small commercial premises, among them dairies that supplied milk and other goods to the surrounding streets on a daily basis, delivered each morning by hand and by cart to households across the neighbourhood. It was in this setting that Mary Sophia Money was employed, in her early 20s, as a bookkeeper at a dairy business on Lavender Hill operated by a dairyman named Bridger. The work of a bookkeeper in an establishment of this kind involved the daily recording of receipts and deliveries, the reconciliation of accounts, and the general administration of a business that depended upon regular, itemised transactions with a large number of individual customers. It was steady, respectable employment of the kind increasingly available to unmarried women of the lower middle class in this period, work that required literacy, numeracy, and a degree of trust reposed by an employer in an employee handling money on his behalf. Mary lived during this period with a fellow employee of the dairy, a young woman named Emma Hone, the two of them sharing lodgings in the vicinity of the business at which they both worked. Of Mary's earlier life, prior to her employment at the Lavender Hill Dairy, the surviving record establishes comparatively little with certainty. Her brother, Robert Money, was by this date a dairy farmer established at Kingston Hill, a village some miles to the southwest of London, and the family's association with the dairy trade appears to have been a consistent one, extending across more than one sibling and more than one household. No detailed record survives of the family's origins, of the couple's parents, or of the circumstances of Mary's upbringing prior to her arrival at the Lavender Hill establishment. The historical account of her life, as it has come down through the surviving sources, begins in earnest only with her employment as a bookkeeper and her residence with Emma Hone, and the account that follows is drawn from that point forward, without speculation as to what came before it. Mary was, by the description available in the surviving record, an unmarried woman in steady employment, living independently of her family in the company of a co-worker, a young woman of the sort who would have been a familiar and unremarkable figure to her neighbours and to the customers of the dairy where she worked. She kept the books of a business that depended upon the trust of its proprietor and the goodwill of its customers, and there is no suggestion in the record that her conduct in that position gave any cause for concern prior to the events of September 1905. She would have walked in the ordinary course of her work and her daily life, the streets of Battersea and the environs of Clapham Junction, streets that by this date were as familiar and as thoroughly urbanised as any in London, filled with the noise and traffic of a railway junction that never entirely fell silent. The record establishes that on the evening of Sunday, the 24th of September 1905, Mary Money left her lodgings and made her way, at some point in the course of that evening, to the vicinity of Clapham Junction railway station. She was seen there by a witness later able to give an account of the occasion at approximately 20 minutes past 7 in the evening. What she told her household, if anything, about her intended destination or the purpose of her outing that evening is not established in the surviving record. She did not return to her lodgings that night, and no member of her family or her household appears to have known, at the time she departed, precisely where she was going, or in whose company she expected to spend the evening. The circumstances of that Sunday evening, so far as they can be reconstructed from the surviving record, suggest that Mary had gone out to meet someone, and that the appointment, if one existed, was not one of which her family or her fellow lodger had prior knowledge. Some accounts of the case describe the possibility of a romantic engagement, an arrangement to meet a man with whom Mary was on terms of some familiarity, though the identity of any such person was never established with certainty, and no one among her acquaintance came forward at the time to identify a suitor she was known to be seeing. This absence of a known companion, notwithstanding the apparent likelihood that she had gone to meet one, is among the central unresolved features of the case, as it has come down through the historical record. A signalman employed along the line gave an account, in the course of the subsequent investigation, of having observed what appeared to be a man and a woman, in circumstances suggesting a struggle, within a first-class compartment of a train passing along the route that evening. The compartments of first-class carriages on lines of this kind, at this date, characteristically lacked a corridor connection to adjoining compartments, a design feature that afforded privacy to passengers travelling together, but which also meant that an incident occurring within such a compartment might pass entirely unheard and unseen by other passengers travelling in the same train. If the signalman's account is accepted as reliable, it places Mary aboard a train that evening in the company of another person, in circumstances consistent with some manner of physical confrontation, though the account does not by itself establish who the other person was or what passed between them. One theory, advanced some years after the event, and reported in a periodical review of the case published in 1912, suggested that Mary may have taken money belonging to her employer, and that an invented engagement or arrangement may have served to explain her circumstances or her conduct to those around her. This theory was speculative in nature at the time it was advanced, resting on inference rather than established fact, and it does not appear to have been substantiated by evidence produced at the time of the original investigation or inquest. The surviving record does not establish that Mary misappropriated funds from her employer, and the theory is recorded here only as one account offered after the fact, not as an established feature of the case. What can be stated with confidence is that Mary Money left her lodgings on the evening of Sunday, the 24th of September 1905, was seen near Clapham Junction Station shortly after 7 in the evening, and was not seen alive again by anyone able to give a subsequent account of her movements. She boarded, or was believed to have boarded, a train travelling south along the London to Brighton line, a train that would in due course pass through the tunnel at Merstham on its route through the North Downs toward the Sussex coast. Whatever took place after she was last seen at the junction remains, on the surviving record, a matter of inference rather than established fact, reconstructed only from the physical evidence subsequently discovered and from the single account of the signalman who reported witnessing a struggle in a first-class compartment that evening. Her body was discovered in the Merstham Tunnel shortly before 11 o'clock that same night, found by a gang of workmen making their way through the tunnel in the course of their duties along the line. The discovery was reported by a man named William Peacock, described in the surviving accounts, in terms that vary as to his precise position, some describing him as a foreman of the workmen who found the body, and others describing him as holding a position of authority within the railway constabulary. Whatever his precise office, it was Peacock who brought the discovery to the attention of the authorities, setting in motion the investigation that followed. The immediate impression created by the discovery of a body within a railway tunnel was not in the first instance unambiguous. A body found in such a location might, in principle, be the result of an accident, a passenger who had fallen from a moving train through misadventure, or it might represent a case of self-destruction, a person who had thrown herself from a train deliberately. Both possibilities were consistent, in a general sense, with the fact of a body being found within a tunnel, along an active railway line, and in the earliest hours after the discovery, before the physical evidence had been fully examined, the case might reasonably have been understood as one or the other of these possibilities, rather than as an act of violence committed by another party. It was the specific condition in which the body was found that displaced these initial possibilities and established, in the view of those first examining the scene, that a crime had taken place. A scarf had been forced into Mary's throat, a detail inconsistent with an accidental fall and equally inconsistent with the ordinary manner of a suicide by jumping from a train. Marks were also found upon the wall of the tunnel, consistent with some manner of contact or collision, though the precise significance of these marks was a matter considered further in the course of the subsequent medical examination and inquest. Taken together, the condition of the body and the marks at the scene were sufficient to persuade the investigating authorities that the case should be treated as one of murder rather than accident or self-destruction, and the investigation proceeded on that basis from an early stage. No purse was recovered upon or near the body, and no identifying papers, letters, or railway ticket were found upon her person, a circumstance that complicated the initial process of establishing who the deceased woman was. In the absence of identifying documents, the authorities proceeded by circulating a description of the woman and the circumstances of the discovery, a method of establishing identity that depended upon someone coming forward who recognised the description as matching a person known to be missing. This method proved effective within a comparatively short space of time. Robert Money, Mary's brother, the dairy farmer of Kingston Hill, came forward upon seeing or hearing the circulated description and travelled to identify the body formally on the morning of Monday, the 25th of September, the day following the discovery. The absence of the victim's purse, papers and ticket, taken together with the circumstances of her death, raised from the outset the question of motive, and specifically the question of whether robbery had formed any part of the reason for the attack upon her. The investigating authorities were unable to establish with confidence whether the missing items had been taken by an assailant as an object of the crime, or whether they had simply been lost or gone astray in the course of the events that led to her death, whether through a fall, a struggle, or some other physical circumstance attending her final movements aboard the train. This question, like a number of others arising from the case, was never resolved to a point of certainty in the surviving record. The investigation, once formally opened, proceeded along several distinct lines of inquiry. Officers were dispatched to trace Mary's movements on the evening in question, beginning from her lodgings and proceeding through the vicinity of Clapham Junction Station in an effort to establish who had seen her, at what times, and in what company. Statements were taken from those who had observed her in the course of that Sunday evening, including the witness who placed her near the station at approximately 20 minutes past 7, and from staff and passengers who might have observed her boarding a train or travelling in the company of another person. The railway company's own staff, including guards, ticket collectors, and signalmen along the relevant stretch of line, were interviewed as part of this process, in an effort to reconstruct, as precisely as possible, the sequence of the train's journey and any unusual occurrence observed along the route. Officers also directed inquiries toward Mary's personal circumstances, seeking to establish whether she had been known to be seeing any particular man, and whether any such association might account for her presence on the train that evening and for the presence of a companion in her compartment. In the course of these inquiries, a railway clerk was identified who had, according to the information gathered, been known to have kept company with Mary on previous occasions, a circumstance that made him an obvious initial object of suspicion. This man was questioned at length regarding his movements on the evening of the 24th of September, and he was able to produce an account of his whereabouts that the investigating authorities found sufficient to eliminate him from further suspicion. No further evidence was developed connecting him to the events of that evening, and he does not appear to have remained a suspect beyond this initial stage of the inquiry. A second line of inquiry concerned an unidentified man, described by at least one witness as having been seen in the company of a woman matching Mary's description aboard a train on the relevant evening. This man was described as of slender build, wearing a moustache and dressed in a bowler hat, a description sufficiently detailed to be circulated, but not sufficiently distinctive, evidently, to result in his identification. Despite efforts to trace this individual through the description provided, no person was ever conclusively identified as matching it in a manner that satisfied the investigating authorities of his connection to the case, and he remained, throughout the investigation and thereafter, an unidentified figure. The investigation also extended to an examination of Mary's financial and professional circumstances at the dairy where she was employed, in light of the theory later advanced in print that she might have taken money belonging to her employer. The surviving record does not establish that this line of inquiry produced evidence to substantiate such a claim at the time, and the theory appears to have gained currency chiefly in retrospective discussion of the case some years afterward, rather than as a finding of the original investigation. Investigators at the time appear to have treated the question of an unknown male companion, rather than any question of misappropriated funds, as the central and most promising avenue of inquiry. Despite the range of inquiries pursued, including the tracing of Mary's final movements, the interview of railway staff and passengers, the elimination of the railway clerk as a suspect, and the attempted identification of the unnamed man seen aboard the train, the investigation did not succeed in identifying any individual against whom sufficient evidence could be brought to justify a charge. The case remained, from a comparatively early stage in the proceedings, one in which the central facts of the death were established with reasonable confidence, while the identity of any person responsible for it remained wholly unknown. This combination, a well-established fact of violent death alongside a complete absence of an identified perpetrator is characteristic of the case, as it has been preserved in the historical record. The investigation into Mary Money's death was conducted under the jurisdiction associated with the railway upon which the crime had occurred, a jurisdiction that, in the structures of the period, was associated with the policing arrangements maintained by the railway companies, themselves in cooperation with the County Constabulary of Surrey. The case has, in the long course of time since 1905, come to be preserved within the institutional history of the body that today constitutes British Transport Police, which maintains a formal historical record of the case among its catalogue of significant unsolved investigations from the early years of railway policing. This institutional preservation of the case, distinct from its treatment in press or popular accounts, reflects the case's continued significance within the specific administrative and professional history of railway law enforcement in Britain. The medical examination of Mary Money's body was conducted by an expert engaged in this capacity from the Home Office, whose name is not established with certainty in the surviving record. The examination established that she had sustained injuries consistent with a violent event occurring aboard, or in connection with, a moving train, injuries that were severe and rapidly fatal in their nature. The examining physician noted that certain bruising and other injuries appeared to have been sustained before death, a finding consistent with some manner of struggle having taken place prior to the fatal event, rather than injuries sustained solely in the course of a fall after death had already occurred or independent of any prior physical confrontation. The examination further established an estimate of the time of death, placing it at approximately 1 hour prior to the discovery of the body shortly before 11 o'clock that night, which would place the moment of death at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. This estimate was consistent with the timeline established by the witness who had seen Mary near Clapham Junction Station at 20 minutes past 7, allowing for a period of some hours during which she might have travelled by train some distance from London before the fatal event occurred. The examining physician also noted that Mary had eaten a meal approximately 3 hours before her death, a finding that, taken together with the estimated time of death, placed her meal at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, consistent again with the general timeline of her having been seen near the station shortly after that hour. The medical examination additionally addressed the question of sexual assault, and the examining physician found no evidence that such an assault had taken place. This finding was significant to the framing of the case, as one primarily concerning an unresolved question of violence and possible robbery, rather than one in which sexual violence formed a documented feature of the crime. The medical findings, taken as a whole, established the fact and approximate timing of a violent death, without resolving the central question of how that violence had come to be inflicted upon her, whether by a fall precipitated by another person, by a direct assault followed by her being cast from the train, or by some other sequence of events consistent with the injuries observed. An inquest was convened in the aftermath of the discovery, in accordance with the ordinary procedure required for a death occurring under violent or unexplained circumstances. The surviving record does not establish the precise date, venue, or the name of the coroner presiding over these proceedings with sufficient certainty to state them here, and no such details are asserted in this account beyond the fact that an inquest was held. Evidence gathered in the course of the investigation, including the medical findings and the accounts given by witnesses, such as the signal man who described a struggle within a first-class compartment, was presented in the course of these proceedings. The central and unresolved question before the inquest concerned the manner in which Mary Money had come to leave the train, whether she had fallen accidentally, had been pushed or thrown by another person, or had left the train under some other circumstance not fully reconstructed by the evidence available. The inquest was not able to resolve this question with the certainty required to return a finding attributing her death definitively to any one of these possible causes, beyond the general conclusion, supported by the medical evidence and the condition in which the body was found, that her death had resulted from violence rather than natural causes or simple misadventure of a kind unconnected to any other party. No individual was named or committed for trial as a result of the inquest proceedings, and the question of exactly how she came to leave the train, whether by another's hand or otherwise, remained without a definitive answer in the official record. The failure of the inquest to resolve this central question reflects the broader character of the case as it has survived in the historical record, a case in which the fact of violent death was clearly established through medical and physical evidence, while the precise mechanism and the identity of any responsible party remained beyond the reach of the evidence available to the investigating and inquiring authorities. This is a genuine and enduring gap in the record, not a matter later clarified by subsequent developments, and no such clarification is asserted here. In the absence of any individual charged in connection with Mary Money's death, no trial took place, no sentence was passed, and no term of imprisonment or capital punishment followed from the events of September 1905. The case was, in the terminology used by the investigating authorities at the time and preserved in the institutional record since, closed without resolution so far as the identification of a responsible party was concerned, while remaining open in the sense that no individual was ever formally cleared of suspicion through the establishment of an alternative, fully explained account of her death. The years following the investigation saw no new arrest, no confession, and no fresh evidence sufficient to reopen the question of who, if anyone, other than Mary herself, was present at the moment of her death. The railway clerk who had been an early object of suspicion was not further implicated, and the unidentified man in the bowler hat, described by a single witness, was never traced or identified. The case passed, in the years that followed, into the category of unsolved historical crimes associated with the railway network of the early 20th century, remembered chiefly within the specific institutional history of railway policing and within the more general interest maintained by local historians of Surrey and of the London to Brighton line in the notable events of their districts past. The case of Mary Money has been the subject of periodic treatment in works concerned with unsolved crimes of the early 20th century, among them a book-length account published in 2016 under the title Unsolved 1905, which examined the case alongside other crimes of that year that were never brought to a conclusive resolution. The case has also been discussed in periodic articles produced by local history societies and regional publications with an interest in the history of Surrey and of the railway line on which the crime occurred, reflecting a pattern of sustained but geographically concentrated interest in the case rather than the kind of broad national recognition attached to some other crimes of the period. British Transport Police, the modern institutional successor to the railway policing structures that investigated the case in 1905, maintains a formal historical account of the case among its records of significant unsolved investigations, a distinction that marks the case as one preserved through institutional as well as popular channels of historical memory. Mary Money's case is remembered today principally within the specific historical traditions of railway policing and of Surrey local history, rather than within the broader canon of nationally recognised crimes of the Edwardian period. It is counted among a small number of cases from this era involving violent death aboard railway carriages, crimes that drew particular attention at the time owing to the relative novelty and privacy afforded by railway compartments, lacking corridor access, a feature of railway design that made such compartments a site in which violence could occur unseen and unheard by other passengers travelling within the same train. The case did not produce any change in railway design or regulation that can be directly attributed to it in the surviving record, and its legacy is preserved chiefly as a matter of institutional and local historical record rather than as a case that altered the practices of the railway companies or the police forces responsible for their security. Mary Money's circumstances, as they are preserved in the record, reflect a particular stratum of Edwardian society, that of the unmarried working woman of the lower middle class, employed in a respectable clerical capacity, living apart from her family in the company of a fellow employee, and possessed of a degree of personal independence that was, by the standards of an earlier generation, comparatively new. This independence extended to a capacity to leave her lodgings on a Sunday evening without a full account of her destination being known to those around her, a small but significant marker of the changing position of women of her class and generation within English society at the turn of the century. It was this same independence, the surviving record suggests, that placed her beyond the observation of her family and her household at the precise moment when she most needed it, boarding a train into the gathering dark of a September evening in the company, it appears likely, of a person whose identity was never established and whose intentions toward her were never made known to any inquiry convened in the aftermath of her death. The investigation into Mary Money's death was formally concluded without an arrest, and the case was entered into the historical record as unresolved. The file remained open. The question of what took place within that railway compartment on the evening of the 24th of September 1905 was never answered. The description that was circulated in the aftermath of Mary Money's death travelled through the ordinary channels available to the police of the period, transmitted by telegraph between the County Constabulary of Surrey and the Metropolitan Force in London, and published within a matter of days in newspapers serving both the capital and the towns along the Brighton line. Local weekly papers in Surrey and Sussex, together with the London evening press, gave the case prominent notice in the days immediately following the discovery, drawn by the unusual and disquieting circumstance of a young woman found dead within a railway tunnel, a setting that combined the ordinary experience of daily commuting with an act of violence few readers could easily reconcile with their own use of the same line. Correspondents were dispatched from London to Merstham and to the nearby town of Redhill, from which the tunnel and the surrounding stretch of line were most readily reached, to gather what details could be obtained from local residents, from railway staff, and from the police officers engaged in the search. The village of Merstham itself, in the days following the discovery, became for a short period an object of considerable outside attention, its ordinary rhythms of quarry work and lime burning interrupted by the presence of investigators, reporters, and curious onlookers drawn by accounts of the case appearing in the press. The lime works and chalk quarries that had long given the village its particular character and its particular smell, a persistent dust that settled on rooftops and hedgerows throughout the district, continued their operation through this period largely undisturbed, the search for evidence being confined chiefly to the tunnel itself and to the length of track approaching it from the north. Residents of the village, accustomed to the regular passage of trains through the tunnel at intervals throughout the day and night, were questioned as to whether they had heard or observed anything unusual on the evening of the 24th of September, though the tunnel's considerable length and the enclosed nature of the passage through it meant that sounds occurring within it were unlikely to carry to those outside. The search of the tunnel itself, conducted in the hours and days following the discovery of the body, was carried out by lamplight along its full length, officers and railway employees walking the track bed and examining the brick lining of the walls for any further sign of the events that had taken place there. The tunnel's interior, lit only by the lamps carried by the search party, presented a damp and blackened surface, the brickwork darkened by decades of soot and steam from the passage of locomotives, the air within carrying the particular closeness and the smell of coal smoke characteristic of a long tunnel on an active line. It was against this backdrop that the marks upon the tunnel wall, noted in the course of the initial examination of the scene, were more closely studied in an effort to determine whether they had been caused by contact with the body as it left the train, or whether they had arisen from some other cause unconnected with the events of that evening. Officers also undertook the more painstaking work of tracing the particular train upon which Mary Money was believed to have travelled, consulting the timetable in force upon the line that Sunday evening, and identifying the services that had passed through the Merstham Tunnel in the hours during which her death was estimated to have occurred. Guards and drivers who had worked those services were sought out and questioned as to whether they had observed anything irregular in the course of their duties, whether any passenger had been seen boarding or alighting at stations along the route in a manner inconsistent with the ordinary pattern of travel, and whether any compartment had shown, upon later inspection, any sign consistent with a struggle having taken place within it. This work of reconstruction, matching times, stations, and the movements of specific trains against the limited window established by the medical evidence, formed one of the more exacting components of the investigation, requiring the coordination of railway staff records with the accounts given by witnesses along the line. Members of the public who believed they had seen Mary Money, or a woman answering her description, in the course of that Sunday evening, came forward to police stations in London and in Surrey in response to the published descriptions, offering accounts that investigating officers were obliged to weigh, corroborate where possible, and in many instances set aside as mistaken or unrelated to the case. This process of sifting public information common to investigations of this kind, conducted in an era in which the press served as the primary means of soliciting assistance from the public, occupied a considerable portion of the time and resources devoted to the case in its early weeks, without ultimately producing the decisive lead that might have led to the identification of the man seen with her aboard the train. The dairy on Lavender Hill, where Mary had been employed, continued its ordinary business throughout this period, its proprietor and its remaining staff, among them Emma Hone, subject to repeated questioning by officers seeking any detail of Mary's habits, her acquaintances, or her movements in the weeks preceding her death that might illuminate the events of that Sunday evening. Mary Money's funeral took place within a matter of days of the formal identification of her body, arrangements made under the direction of her family, with her brother, Robert Money, among those in attendance. The service was conducted according to the ordinary rites of the period for a woman of her station, and she was laid to rest in a burial ground in the vicinity most closely associated with her family's residence. The precise details of the plot and its subsequent marking not preserved in the sources available for this account. Members of the local community in Battersea, including those who had known her through her work at the dairy on Lavender Hill, and residents of Merstham who had followed the case through its extensive coverage in the local and London press, were reported by contemporary accounts to have taken a close interest in the proceedings, an interest reflecting the wider public fascination the case had generated in the week since the discovery of her body. Emma Hone, who had shared lodgings with Mary in the period before her death, gave an account of her friend's habits and character to the officers investigating the case, an account that, so far as the surviving record indicates, did not depart from the general impression of a young woman engaged in steady employment and ordinary sociability, without any documented history of association with disreputable company, or any pattern of behaviour that might have marked her as a likely target of violence. The dairyman Bridger, for his part, continued to operate his business on Lavender Hill in the months following Mary's death, and the position she had occupied as bookkeeper was in due course filled by another employee, the ordinary continuation of commercial life proceeding alongside an investigation that remained throughout this period without a resolution. The press coverage that had been so extensive in the days immediately following the discovery diminished gradually over the weeks that followed, as is characteristic of newspaper treatment of cases in which no arrest follows quickly upon an initial investigation. Reports grew shorter and less frequent, confined increasingly to brief notices recording that the police had, as yet, no new information to disclose, until by the close of the year the case had largely receded from the columns of the daily press, remaining a matter of continuing but no longer urgent interest to the specific communities of Battersea and Merstham most directly touched by it. The file maintained by the investigating authorities remained open in the formal sense throughout this period, available for the addition of any new evidence that might come to light. Though the passage of weeks and then months without a significant development left the case in the position it was substantially to occupy for the remainder of its history, a matter of record rather than of active pursuit. The case of Mary Money was not without precedent among crimes associated with the railway network of southern England. In this period, a small number of earlier incidents having involved violence committed within railway compartments, a setting that, as has been noted, afforded privacy to passengers travelling together, but which also removed any possibility of intervention or observation by others aboard the same train. These earlier incidents, occurring at scattered intervals across the preceding decades on lines serving London and its surrounding counties, had contributed to a degree of public unease regarding the safety of railway travel for solitary passengers, particularly women travelling without a companion known to them, an unease to which Mary Money's death gave renewed and immediate expression in the autumn of 1905. The design of first-class compartments without corridor access, a feature already noted in connection with the events of that Sunday evening, was raised in the aftermath of the case as a subject of public comment, though the surviving record does not establish that any specific alteration to railway carriage design was adopted by the companies operating the London to Brighton line as a direct consequence of Mary Money's death. The Surrey Constabulary and the railway policing authorities responsible for the initial investigation maintained the case among their records in the years that followed, revisiting it on occasion as new information was offered by members of the public. Though none of these later communications is recorded as having produced evidence sufficient to identify a suspect or to reopen the inquiry in any substantial way. Robert Money, having formally identified his sister's body and given his account to the investigating officers in the days following her death, returned to his occupation as a dairy farmer at Kingston Hill. His own later life did not, however, pass without further notice. In September 1912, Scotland Yard identified the perpetrator of a bigamy and murder-suicide at Eastbourne, a man known as Robert Hicks Murray, as Robert Money himself, though the identification was disputed at the time and never conclusively confirmed. The records generated by the original investigation into Mary Money's death, the witness statements, the medical findings, the correspondence between the Surrey Constabulary and the railway policing authorities were preserved as case papers in the manner customary for unresolved inquiries of the period, retained in the expectation that some future development, however unlikely, might yet permit the case to be brought to a conclusion. When the separate police forces maintained by the individual railway companies of Britain were brought together under a single unified body in the years following the Second World War, the surviving papers relating to unresolved cases from the earlier company-based era of railway policing were transferred into the keeping of the new organisation, carried forward as part of an institutional memory that extended back to the years before the different regional railway police forces had been merged into what would in time become known as British Transport Police. It is through this chain of institutional continuity, rather than through any single dramatic rediscovery, that the case of Mary Money has remained accessible to historians and researchers in the century, and more since her death, her file surviving not because of any singular act of preservation, but because of the ordinary, unbroken administrative practice of a police service that did not discard the unresolved matters entrusted to its predecessors. The tunnel at Merstham itself continued in active use throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, carrying an increasing volume of rail traffic between London and the south coast as the decades passed. Its brick lining strengthened and its ventilation and signalling apparatus modernised at intervals, in keeping with the general advance of railway engineering, while the fact of what had occurred within it in September of 1905 remained a matter known chiefly to those with a particular interest in the history of the line or in the unsolved crimes associated with the railway network of the Edwardian period. Passengers travelling the route in the years since have done so without any outward indication within the tunnel itself of the events that once made it briefly a subject of national newspaper attention, the tunnel having long since resumed the character of an entirely ordinary feature of an exceptionally busy commuter line linking the capital to the towns of Surrey and Sussex. The dairy trade in which Mary Money had been employed, and in which her brother Robert continued to work in the years following her death, remained through this period one of the principal sources of steady, if modest, livelihood for families across the districts surrounding London, a trade dependent upon daily routine, regular custom, and the kind of careful bookkeeping that Mary herself had once been entrusted to perform. The particular combination of circumstances that had placed her, on an ordinary Sunday evening, aboard a train travelling south from a station she had passed through on countless previous occasions in the course of her daily life, remains in the surviving record an arrangement of the ordinary and the catastrophic that the investigation of 1905, for all its diligence, was never able to fully explain. The physical descriptions circulated by the police in the days following the discovery, before Robert Money had come forward to identify his sister, described a young woman of medium height and slight build, dressed in the manner customary for a woman of her class and occupation, attending to an ordinary evening engagement, her clothing including a jacket and skirt of a dark colour, together with a hat secured in the fashion typical of the period. This description, printed in full in a number of newspapers, alongside an account of the circumstances of the discovery, was intended to reach anyone who might have seen a woman answering to it in the streets around Clapham Junction or aboard a train travelling south that Sunday evening, and it was this description, rather than any name, that first drew the attention of those who would later come forward with information, mistaken or otherwise, regarding her final movements. The absence of a name attached to the description in its earliest publication meant that for the better part of a full day, the woman found in the Merstham Tunnel was known to the public only through these particulars of appearance and dress, a nameless figure whose identity was established only once her brother had travelled from Kingston Hill to confirm what the police had by then come to suspect. In the days following the discovery, search parties composed of railway employees, police constables, and in some instances local volunteers familiar with the ground, extended their efforts beyond the tunnel itself to the open cutting and embankment on either side of its mouth, examining the grass and undergrowth of the North Downs for any object that might have been lost or discarded in the course of the events of that evening. This search of the surrounding ground, conducted in the days immediately after the body was found, proceeded methodically along the length of track approaching the tunnel from the London direction, in the expectation that an object, such as the missing purse, or some other item belonging to Mary or to an unknown assailant, might have been thrown or dropped from the train before it entered the tunnel itself. The chalk downland in this stretch of Surrey, cut through by the deep excavation, carrying the railway on its route toward Redhill and the coast beyond, presented long grassy banks and scattered stands of hawthorn, he and gorse in which a small object might easily come to rest unnoticed, and the search of this ground, though thorough, did not yield any item that could be connected with certainty to the crime. The absence of any such recovered object, taken together with the absence of the purse and papers from the body itself, left investigators without the kind of physical evidence that might, in another case, have pointed more directly toward a specific individual or a specific motive. It was this absence, as much as any particular fact established by the investigation, that came to characterise the case in the assessment of those who examined it, both at the time and in later years. A crime in which the central facts of violence and death were established with confidence, while the surrounding evidence necessary to identify a responsible party proved persistently unobtainable. The search parties were withdrawn from the embankment after some days without further result, their efforts recorded in the case papers as an additional line of inquiry pursued and exhausted, rather than one that produced a decisive contribution to the investigation. The circumstances of Mary Money's death, coming as they did within a period in which a small number of earlier crimes had already raised public concern regarding the safety of solitary railway travel, prompted a degree of correspondence in the newspapers of the following weeks concerning the design of railway carriages then in general use across the network. Letters published in the London press in the aftermath of the case raised the question of whether compartments lacking a corridor connection to the remainder of the train, a design still common on many services in 1905 despite the gradual introduction of corridor stock on principal mainline trains, left solitary passengers and women travelling alone or in the company of a single companion exposed to a danger that a connected train, allowing passage between compartments and the presence of a guard able to patrol its length, would have substantially reduced. This correspondence formed part of a broader and longer-running public discussion regarding railway carriage design that had been underway for some years before 1905 and that continued for some years afterward, a discussion in which Mary Money's death was cited, alongside a small number of earlier incidents as an illustration of the risks attending the older compartment design, rather than as the sole or originating cause of the debate. The railway companies operating services on the London to Brighton line and elsewhere across the network continued, through the years immediately following 1905, a gradual programme of introducing corridor carriages on their principal services, a change driven by considerations of passenger comfort and operational convenience as much as by the safety concerns raised in the aftermath of cases such as Mary Money's. And the surviving record does not establish that any specific alteration to the rolling stock used on the Brighton line was undertaken as a direct and immediate consequence of her death. The older compartment stock, of the type in which she is believed to have travelled on the evening of her death, remained in service on many lines across the country for a number of years afterward, gradually withdrawn and replaced in the ordinary course of the railway company's investment in newer rolling stock, rather than through any single measure adopted in direct response to the events at Merstham. The identity of the perpetrator was not established, no conviction followed, none was ever sought. That is where the record of the second case closes. We turn now to the third and final case examined here, one further removed still from public memory than the two accounts that preceded it, unfolding not in a country garden or beside a railway line, but within the close, gas-lit streets of central London, in a decade when the courts and the newspapers were already occupied with more than one such account of a woman found dead in a rented room. The case of Annie Yates begins in Bloomsbury, London, in the early spring of 1884. The record itself is not entirely certain of her name, a point that will be addressed directly before the account proceeds further. Bloomsbury in 1884 was a district in the midst of a long and visible change. Built up across the late Georgian period as a fashionable quarter of terraced squares and crescents for professional and mercantile families, by the 1880s, much of its housing stock had passed out of that original use. Burton Crescent, where this case unfolds, had been constructed between 1809 and 1811, its tall, flat-fronted terraces originally intended for households of modest but comfortable means, each with a basement kitchen, a ground floor for receiving visitors, and upper floors given over to bedrooms, and in time to let rooms. By the 1880s, a significant number of these houses had been subdivided into lodgings, let by the week or the month to tenants who bore little resemblance to the original occupants the builders had in mind. Bloomsbury in this period sat within a wider swath of central London, bounded roughly by the Euston Road to the north and the British Museum to the south, that housed a shifting population of clerks, students, itinerant workers, and women supporting themselves independently, many of them without family connections in the capital. The Euston Road itself, running along the northern edge of the district, was one of London's principal thoroughfares, carrying traffic toward the railway. termini at Euston, King's Cross, and St Pancras, all three within a short walk of Burton Crescent. The road was lit by gas lamps at intervals through the 1880s, casting a yellowed and uneven light along its length, sufficient to see figures, but not always sufficient to see them clearly. At night the road remained active, later than the surrounding residential streets, owing to the passage of travellers arriving from and departing to the termini at all hours, and it was known, as many such thoroughfares near London's railway stations were known in this period, as a place where women worked soliciting custom from men passing along it. The presence of women engaged in this trade near the great termini was neither unusual nor, in the newspapers of the day, treated as remarkable in itself. It became remarkable only when violence followed, as it had done more than once in this same quarter of London in the years before 1884. 12 Burton Crescent stood among the terrace's subdivided houses, let out in furnished rooms to a number of tenants under a single landlord or landlady, a common arrangement for houses of this type and district by the 1880s. The historical record establishes that several women lived in the house at the material time, at least some of them, like Annie Yates, supporting themselves through prostitution, and that this arrangement was ordinary enough within the house and the surrounding streets to attract no particular comment from neighbours. The house itself, 4 stories over a basement in the pattern common to Burton Crescent's terraces, offered a first-floor back room to Annie Yates, among other lets within the same building. It was into this room that she moved roughly 3 weeks before her death, and it was in this room that she was later found. Almost nothing survives in the documented record concerning Annie Yates before her arrival at Burton Crescent. Her name itself is recorded inconsistently across the surviving sources. She was known at the address and was referred to at the subsequent inquest and in contemporary newspaper accounts as Annie Yates, and it is this name that this account uses throughout. Some sources record her instead as Mary Ann Yates. At least one account further states that a friend or acquaintance identified her true name as Mary Ann Marshall, raising the possibility that Yates was itself an assumed name, a practice not uncommon among women in her circumstances in this period, who at times adopted a working name distinct from the name given at birth. The available record does not resolve this question. It cannot be stated with certainty which name, if any, represents the name under which she had been born, and this account does not attempt to settle a matter that the surviving documentation itself leaves open. One further thread appears in the record, thin and unconfirmed, connecting her to Reading, though no detail survives to establish the nature of that connection, whether of birth, family, or prior residence. No account of her parents, her siblings, her early life, or the path that brought her to London and to Burton Crescent has been located in the sources reviewed for this case. She is present in the historical record only from the point of her tenancy at Burton Crescent onward, a period of some 3 weeks before her death, and the account that follows is necessarily built upon that narrow window. What can be established is that Annie Yates, in the weeks preceding her death, was living at Burton Crescent and supporting herself through prostitution, soliciting custom in the vicinity of Euston Road, a short walk from her lodgings. She was known to at least one fellow lodger in the house, a woman named Annie Ellis, with whom she appears to have had an ordinary acquaintance consistent with women sharing a common lodging house and a common trade. Nothing in the surviving record indicates any particular dispute, threat, or unusual circumstance affecting Annie Yates in the days immediately before the night of the 8th of March, 1884. The pattern of her life, so far as the record allows it to be reconstructed, appears to have been an ordinary one for a woman in her situation and her district, until the night in question altered it entirely. On the night of the 8th of March, 1884, Annie Yates was seen on Euston Road, in company with Annie Ellis, sometime around midnight. The two women appear to have been engaged in the same trade along the same stretch of road, a common enough arrangement, and it was in the course of this that Annie Yates entered into conversation with a man previously unknown to Ellis and, so far as the record indicates, unknown to Yates as well. Ellis was able afterward to provide a description of this man to investigators. He was described as approximately 25 years of age, of fair complexion and fair hair, of medium height and respectable in appearance and dress, wearing a black felt hat and a brown cutaway coat. Nothing in Ellis's account suggests that the man's approach or manner gave any cause for concern at the time. Following this encounter, Annie Yates and Annie Ellis parted ways along Euston Road, each continuing about her own business, in a manner that appears to have been entirely ordinary to both women at that hour. The next point at which Annie Yates can be placed with any confidence is somewhat after 2 o'clock in the morning, when sounds within the house at Burton Crescent suggested that she had returned to her room and that she had not returned alone. The record does not establish this through direct observation of her entering the house, but through the inference drawn afterward by other lodgers from sounds heard at that hour, consistent with an arrival to her first-floor back room, accompanied by another person. This was not, in itself, an unusual occurrence within a house of this character, and nothing in the surviving account suggests that any of the other lodgers regarded it as noteworthy at the time. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, a sound described as a scream, or a scream-like, was heard from the direction of Annie Yates's room. This detail is among the most significant to survive in the documented record of this case, not for what it reveals about the crime itself, but for what it reveals about the household's response to it. Other lodgers within the house, on hearing the sound, did not investigate. The surviving account attributes this to a familiarity among the household with what is described as Annie Yates's occasional bouts of hysteria, a term used within the record itself, and it appears that the sound heard that night was taken by those who heard it to be nothing more than a recurrence of a pattern they had encountered before. No one in the house rose to check upon her. No one summoned assistance. The sound passed, and the house returned to whatever quiet it had held before it. At some point after this, though the precise hour is not established in the surviving record, a man was heard descending the stairs of the house and departing from it. This, too, appears to have drawn no particular attention at the time, consistent with a household in which the comings and goings of visitors to the various lodgers were an unremarkable feature of the night. It is this man, heard leaving the house in the small hours of the 9th of March, whom the subsequent investigation would never succeed in identifying by name, though a description of him, drawn from Annie Ellis's account of the man seen on Euston Road some hours earlier, would form the principal thread the police were able to pursue. The household at Burton Crescent continued about its ordinary business through the remainder of the night and into the following morning, undisturbed by any further sound from the first-floor back room. It was not until the middle of the day, between approximately noon and 1 o'clock on the 9th of March, that any member of the household had occasion to approach Annie Yates's door. Annie Ellis, the same fellow lodger who had parted from Yates on Euston Road the night before, went to the room and found the door already standing ajar. What she found within would bring an end to the ordinary pattern of the household's night, though it would do nothing to answer the question of who the man in the black felt hat and brown cutaway coat had been, nor why the scream heard at 3 o'clock that morning had gone unanswered by anyone within the house who might have intervened. Annie Ellis found Annie Yates lying face down within the room, blood upon the floor and upon the nearby wall, and a lamp still burning on its stand, though daylight had long since replaced the need for it. Annie Yates was partially dressed. A towel was found tied tightly about her mouth and neck, drawn with sufficient force to have caused her death by strangulation and suffocation together. Her hands were found still gripping the towel, a detail the subsequent examination would treat as evidence that she had struggled against it before she died, ruling out any possibility that the injury had been self-inflicted or accidental. Annie Ellis did not remain in the room. She raised the alarm within the house, and word was sent for the police. Officers arrived at Burton Crescent within a short time of the discovery and secured the room as it had been found. A search of the immediate premises and of Annie Yates's few possessions established that certain items were missing. A dark leather purse containing approximately 3 shillings could not be located. A ring of 9-carat gold set with turquoise and a pearl was likewise missing from among her belongings. At the same time, officers recovered from the room a half-sovereign and 6 shillings, left untouched in a place where they would have been readily found by anyone searching the room for money. This detail was noted at the time as significant, and it would continue to be treated as significant throughout the investigation that followed. A person intent upon robbery as the sole object of the crime would ordinarily be expected to take all money discovered, not a portion of it, and the presence of undisturbed coin alongside a missing purse and a missing ring suggested to those investigating that theft, whatever role it had played, was unlikely to have been the principal motive behind what had occurred in the room that night. The body of Annie Yates was examined by 2 physicians, named in the surviving record as Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper. Their examination established that death had resulted from strangulation and suffocation, caused by the towel drawn tightly against her mouth and about her neck. The examination further recorded a gash above her left ear and bruising to the backs of her legs, injuries consistent with a struggle having taken place within the room before death occurred. The physician's findings, taken together with the position in which her hands were found upon the towel, were regarded as establishing beyond reasonable question that Annie Yates had died as the result of a deliberate act carried out by another person, and not through any accident or any act of her own. Officers attached to the investigation, recorded as Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford, undertook the work of establishing what had occurred within the house on the night in question. Their inquiries proceeded along the lines that the household's own account of the night had already suggested. Statements were taken from Annie Ellis, whose account of the evening on Euston Road, of the man in the black felt hat and brown cutaway coat, and of the scream heard at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, formed the principal narrative upon which the investigation was built. Other residents of the house at Burton Crescent were interviewed in turn, each asked what, if anything, they had heard or observed during the night, and each account was recorded and compared against the others in the effort to establish a reliable timeline of the night's events. The description furnished by Annie Ellis of a man of about 25 years, fair-haired and fair-complexioned, of medium height, respectably dressed in a black felt hat and a brown cutaway coat, was circulated by the investigating officers in the hope of identifying him or securing information as to his whereabouts. Inquiries were made among those who might have had occasion to observe traffic along Euston Road in the hours before midnight, in an effort to corroborate the sighting and, if possible, to trace the man's movements after he was seen speaking with Annie Yates. No name was ever attached to the description, and no individual was ever brought before the investigating officers whom Annie Ellis or any other witness was able to identify with confidence as the man she had seen. The investigation extended to inquiries among Annie Yates's known associates within the district in the effort to establish whether any person known to her might have borne responsibility for what had occurred. But this line of inquiry, like the pursuit of the unidentified man from Euston Road, produced no results sufficient to justify an arrest. In the course of their inquiries, the investigating officers, and in due course the newspapers reporting upon the case, noted certain points of resemblance between the death of Annie Yates and 2 earlier killings within the same general district of London. One of these was the death of Harriet Buswell, a woman found with her throat cut within her bed at an address in Great Coram Street, a short distance from Burton Crescent in the closing days of 1872. The other was a killing recorded as having taken place in Artillery Square in Westminster some months before the death of Annie Yates. The resemblance noted at the time lay chiefly in the circumstances common to all three cases. Women engaged in the same trade, found dead within rented rooms, in each case without an identified perpetrator ever having been brought to trial. This resemblance was recorded as an observation made by those investigating and reporting upon the case in 1884. It was not accompanied, in the surviving record, by any evidence connecting a single individual to more than one of these deaths, and the investigation into the death of Annie Yates proceeded, so far as the record establishes, as an inquiry into her death alone. An inquest into the death of Annie Yates was convened before a coroner, in keeping with the requirement that any sudden or violent death be formally examined by an official inquiry of this kind. The precise date, venue, and the name of the presiding coroner have not been established with confidence in the sources available for this account, and this account does not attempt to supply detail beyond what the surviving record permits. The medical findings of Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper were presented in the course of the inquest's proceedings, together with the accounts given by Annie Ellis and by other residents of the house at Burton Crescent, establishing the circumstances of the night as they had been reconstructed by the investigating officers. The inquest, on the evidence before it, was not in a position to name any individual as responsible for the death of Annie Yates, and the proceedings concluded without the identification of a perpetrator. No arrest followed the conclusion of the inquest, and the investigation conducted by Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford was, in time, formally closed without a name ever having been attached to the man Annie Ellis had described on Euston Road. The circulated description, the inquiries made among Annie Yates's known associates, and the comparison drawn with the deaths of Harriet Buswell and the woman killed at Artillery Square together represented the full extent of what the investigation was able to establish. No further evidence came to light in the weeks that followed the inquest's conclusion to reopen the inquiry or to direct it toward any particular individual. The case, so far as the Metropolitan Police were concerned, passed from active inquiry into the standing category of an unsolved death, a category to which a certain proportion of violent deaths within the capital in this period were, in the absence of new evidence, eventually consigned. The newspapers of London and of the wider country reported the death of Annie Yates in the days following its discovery, in the manner typical of the period's coverage of violent deaths among women of her circumstances. Accounts appeared describing the discovery of the body, the missing person ring, the undisturbed coin left within the room, and the description of the man seen with her on Euston Road, presented largely as a factual record of the police investigation's progress, rather than as an occasion for extended editorial comment. The coverage given to the case within the press was neither as extensive nor as sustained as that given to some other violent deaths of the period, and within a matter of weeks, as no arrest followed and no further development presented itself, reporting on the case diminished and ultimately ceased. It did not return to prominent notice within the newspapers of the following years, and no subsequent development, discovery, or renewed inquiry is recorded as having brought it back before the public in any significant way during the remainder of the 19th century. The house at Burton Crescent itself continued in use as lodgings in the years that followed, its rooms let and re-let to a succession of tenants whose names have not been preserved in any record connected to this case. The street on which it stood was renamed in the 20th century, becoming known as Cartwright Gardens, a change that further distanced the address from the case that had once briefly attached itself to it. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that the house was marked, remembered, or associated with the death of Annie Yates by those who came to live within it in the decades that followed. The case, in this respect, followed the pattern common to a great many violent deaths of women in her circumstances during this period, entering the official record through inquest and newspaper report, and then receding from public memory once the immediate business of investigation and reporting had run its course. The death of Annie Yates has not been the subject of any dedicated historical study, book-length treatment, or established entry within the broader literature on London's unsolved crimes of the 19th century. In the manner that certain other cases of this period have received, its presence in the modern record is confined to a small number of accounts compiled by researchers and writers with an interest in London's lesser-known criminal history, drawing upon the surviving newspaper coverage and inquest record to reconstruct the case in outline. These accounts, compiled well over a century after the events they describe, are consistent with one another as to the principal facts of the case, the circumstances of the discovery, the missing items, the investigating officers, and the examining physicians, a consistency that reflects their shared reliance upon the same body of contemporary press coverage, rather than any independent corroboration. Beyond these accounts, the case has occasionally been mentioned within broader surveys of unsolved killings of women in London during the decades preceding the more widely remembered murders of 1888, cited in such contexts as one among several deaths sharing certain circumstances in common, without any of these later treatments asserting a proven connection between the cases so grouped. The investigative resources available to the Metropolitan Police in 1884 shaped, in ways the surviving record makes evident, the course that the inquiry into Annie Yates's death was able to take. Detective work within the Metropolitan Force in this period relied principally upon the interviewing of witnesses and known associates, the circulation of physical descriptions among officers, and where warranted, within the press, and the patient comparison of accounts gathered from those within a household or a neighbourhood who might have observed something of relevance. Photographic and forensic methods that would, in later decades, come to form a standard part of criminal investigation were not generally available to officers conducting an inquiry of this kind in 1884, and the identification of an unknown individual, absent a confession, an informant, or a chance recognition by someone who had seen him before, depended very largely upon the memory and the willingness of witnesses such as Annie Ellis to describe what they had observed. In a case such as this one, where the only substantial description available was that furnished by a single witness of a man she had seen for a matter of minutes, under gaslight in the middle of the night, the investigation's prospects of identifying him with confidence were limited from the outset, regardless of the diligence with which Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford pursued the inquiries available to them. The room in which Annie Yates died remained, in the days immediately following the discovery of her body, much as it had been found, the lamp extinguished only once officers had completed their examination of the scene, the blood upon the floor, and the wall left to be dealt with by whoever next took responsibility for the house's upkeep. The first floor back room at Burton Crescent, furnished as a let for a single tenant, would have contained little beyond the ordinary necessities of such an arrangement: a bed, a washstand, a small table, a chair, and whatever few possessions a woman in Annie Yates's circumstances had accumulated in the 3 weeks of her tenancy there. It was a room of no particular distinction, in a house of no particular distinction, on a street that had, within living memory of its builders, been considered a respectable address and had become, by 1884, one among a great many streets in this part of London, where a woman might rent a single room, live largely unknown to her neighbours beyond the most basic acquaintance, and die within that room without the household around her recognising, in the moment itself, that anything beyond the ordinary had occurred. The killing of Harriet Buswell at Great Coram Street in December of 1872 had, in its own time, produced an inquest and an investigation considerably more extensive than the inquiry that followed the death of Annie Yates 12 years later. A man had in fact been questioned in connection with that earlier case, a foreign visitor lodging in the district at the time, and had been examined before the coroner and identified by certain witnesses as resembling a man seen near the house on the night in question. He was ultimately released without charge, the evidence against him judged insufficient to sustain a prosecution, and the inquest into Harriet Buswell's death returned a verdict of willful murder by some person or persons unknown, the identity of her killer never established with the certainty the law required before a charge could be brought. It was this earlier, partially examined case, still unresolved 12 years on, that stood in the minds of investigators and of the newspapers reporting on Annie Yates's death as the nearest and most instructive point of comparison, a reminder that an inquiry of this kind, however thorough, did not guarantee an answer. The economic circumstances that placed women such as Annie Yates and Annie Ellis within the lodging houses of Bloomsbury and along the length of Euston Road in the 1880s were, in broad terms, well understood by contemporaries, even where the particular history of any one woman in this position went unrecorded. Employment for women without capital, family support, or trade training was limited in this period to a narrow range of occupations: domestic service, needlework, laundry work, and a small number of positions in shops and factories, most of them poorly paid, and many of them irregular. Prostitution offered an income that for some women exceeded what could be earned through these alternatives at the cost of an existence considerably more precarious and, as the deaths of Harriet Buswell and Annie Yates both demonstrate, considerably more dangerous. Rent for a single furnished room in a house such as Burton Crescent, taken by the week, represented a recurring and immediate obligation, one that shaped where a woman in these circumstances could live, and how visible or otherwise her arrangements with the men she met might be to those around her. Annie Yates had held her room at Burton Crescent for some 3 weeks at the time of her death, a tenancy short enough that she remained in the fullest sense a new arrival to the household in which she died, known to her fellow lodgers chiefly through the ordinary courtesies of shared premises rather than through any deeper acquaintance. In the years that followed the closure of the investigation into Annie Yates's death, Burton Crescent and the streets surrounding it continued to change in character, as much of Bloomsbury did across the closing decades of the 19th century and the opening decades of the 20th. The University of London's steady expansion through this part of the district, together with the growth of hotels and boarding establishments serving travellers arriving at the nearby termini, gradually altered the composition of the neighbourhood's population and the uses to which its Georgian terraces were put. The renaming of the street as Cartwright Gardens, carried out in the 20th century, coincided with this broader transformation, by which point the case of Annie Yates had long since passed out of active memory, even among those with a close knowledge of the district's history. No plaque, memorial, or formal marker connects the modern street to the death that occurred within one of its houses in March of 1884, and nothing in the appearance of Cartwright Gardens, as it exists in the present day, would indicate to a passerby that the case had ever taken place there at all. The 2 investigating officers named in connection with the case, Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford, do not appear in the surviving record in connection with any subsequent case that achieved wider notice, and no further detail concerning either officer's career has been located within the sources reviewed for this account. The 2 examining physicians, Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper, are known through this case chiefly for the medical findings entered into the inquest record, findings that establish the cause of Annie Yates's death with sufficient clarity to remove any doubt that her death had resulted from a deliberate act, even as the identity of the person responsible for that act remained, and has remained since, entirely unknown. Annie Ellis, the fellow lodger who parted from Annie Yates on Euston Road shortly before midnight, and who discovered her body the following day, does not appear in the surviving record beyond the account she gave to investigators, and presumably to the inquest, her own subsequent life and circumstances no more documented than those of the woman whose death she reported. The description furnished by Annie Ellis of the man in the black felt hat and the brown cutaway coat remains, in the surviving record of this case, the only substantial lead the investigation was ever able to generate, and it remains, more than a century later, entirely unresolved. No name was ever attached to that description in the official record of the case. No arrest was made, no trial was ever convened. The towel found tied about Annie Yates's neck, the missing purse and ring, the half-sovereign and 6 shillings left untouched within the room, and the scream heard at 3 o'clock in the morning and mistaken by those who heard it for something they had grown used to, together constitute very nearly the whole of what the historical record preserves of the last hours of Annie Yates's life, and of the inquiry that followed it. The killing recorded as having taken place at Artillery Square in Westminster in the months preceding the death of Annie Yates involved, so far as the surviving record establishes, a woman of similar circumstances to Annie Yates and to Harriet Buswell before her, found dead within rented premises in a manner that investigators and the newspapers of March 1884 judged sufficiently similar to warrant mention alongside the case at Burton Crescent. The Artillery Square case, like the deaths of Harriet Buswell and Annie Yates, did not result in an arrest, and no name has survived within the sources reviewed for this account to identify the woman killed there with the same particularity that survives, however imperfectly, for Annie Yates. It was cited by those investigating and reporting upon the death at Burton Crescent as a further instance of the same pattern. 3 women, within little more than a decade, killed within rooms they had rented for their own use, in a portion of London where such rooms were let without particular scrutiny of who came and went from them after dark. The timeline reconstructed by Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford in the course of their inquiry rested upon a small number of fixed points, each established through a separate witness account, and upon the intervals of silence that separated them. Annie Ellis placed her parting from Annie Yates on Euston Road at a point close to midnight, an hour she was able to estimate with reasonable confidence from her own habits of work along that road. The sounds suggesting Annie Yates's return to Burton Crescent in company with another person were placed by other lodgers at a point somewhat after 2 o'clock, an interval of roughly 2 hours during which neither woman's movements can be established with any precision, and during which Annie Yates may have remained upon Euston Road, moved elsewhere within the district, or returned to Burton Crescent earlier than the household's account suggests. The scream heard within the house was placed at approximately 3 o'clock, closing a further interval of perhaps half an hour to an hour between her return and the sound that marked, in all likelihood, the moment of the attack itself. The man heard descending the stairs and leaving the house was placed at some point after this, though no witness was able to fix the hour of his departure with any exactness, leaving open a further stretch of the night during which he remained, unseen and unheard beyond that single set of footsteps upon the stair, within a house of sleeping or silent lodgers who had already dismissed the one sound that might have summoned help. This reconstructed sequence, presented before the coroner in the course of the inquest, was as complete an account of the night as the available witnesses could furnish, and it remains, in substance, the account upon which every subsequent description of the case has relied. It establishes the outer boundaries of the hours during which Annie Yates was killed with reasonable confidence, while leaving the identity of the man responsible and the precise circumstances of what passed between them within the room itself before the scream was heard, entirely outside what the surviving record is able to supply. The gap between midnight, when Annie Ellis last saw her alive and in ordinary conversation with a stranger of respectable appearance, and 3 o'clock, when a sound was heard and dismissed, spans some 3 hours, the greater part of which cannot be accounted for by any surviving witness, and it is within that unaccounted span that whatever led to Annie Yates's death must have taken place. The night of the 8th into the 9th of March 1884 fell within the early weeks of a season in which London's nights remained long and cold, the gas lamps along Euston Road offering the principal illumination available to anyone abroad after dark, their light sufficient to permit recognition at close quarters, but not sufficient to render a stranger's face memorable beyond the broad particulars Annie Ellis was able to supply. The termini at Euston, at King's Cross and at St Pancras, each within easy walking distance of Burton Crescent, would have continued to receive and dispatch trains through a portion of these hours. carrying travellers whose presence along the surrounding streets, at an hour when most of the city's ordinary business had ceased, formed part of the very trade that had brought Annie Yates and Annie Ellis to that stretch of road in the first place. It was against this backdrop of a district still stirring with the traffic of arrival and departure, even as the residential streets around Burton Crescent had settled into stillness, that the events of that night took place, and it was into that same stillness that the scream at 3 o'clock was absorbed, unanswered, by a household that had already decided it required no answer. The uncertainty surrounding Annie Yates's true name was not a difficulty introduced by later research into the case. It was present within the record from the very outset, a consequence of the practice, common among women in her circumstances in this period, of adopting a name for use in lodging houses and in the course of their trade that did not necessarily correspond to the name recorded at their birth. Landladies letting rooms by the week in houses such as the one at Burton Crescent generally had little occasion and less inclination to verify the names given to them by prospective tenants, provided rent was paid and no disturbance resulted. The inquest and the investigating officers were left, in consequence, to proceed upon the name by which Annie Yates had been known within the house and along Euston Road, the name under which she had rented her room, and the name under which the newspapers of March 1884 reported her death. The suggestion that her true name had been Mary Ann Marshall rests upon a single account, attributed to an acquaintance who claimed to know her by that name, and the surviving record does not permit this claim to be verified against any document, such as a birth or baptismal record, that might have settled the question with certainty. Nor does it permit the claim to be dismissed. The record, honestly examined, leaves the matter exactly where it stood in March of 1884, an open question rather than a settled fact, and this account has treated it as such throughout. The ring taken from Annie Yates's room, described in the record as of 9-carat gold, set with turquoise and a pearl, represents one of the very few personal possessions of hers to survive in any description at all. 9-carat gold, a standard alloy in common use for jewellery of modest value throughout the Victorian period, would have placed the ring within reach of a woman of limited means, whether purchased for herself or received as a gift from another, a distinction the surviving record does not allow to be drawn. Turquoise and pearl were both stones in common use in jewellery of this kind during the 1880s, valued for their colour and their relatively modest cost compared with diamonds or other precious stones, and a ring combining the two would have been unremarkable in its general character among the possessions of a woman in Annie Yates's position, distinguished chiefly by the fact that it was hers, that she is recorded as having owned it, and that whoever left her room that night considered it worth taking. The formal conclusion of the investigation into Annie Yates's death left the matter of who had visited her room in the small hours of the 9th of March, and who had left it again before daylight, entirely unresolved. Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford, having exhausted the leads available to them through the description furnished by Annie Ellis and through their inquiries among Annie Yates's known associates, were unable to advance the case beyond the point the inquest itself had reached. The file was closed in the manner customary for cases of this kind, entered into the record of the Metropolitan Force as an unsolved death, available for reopening should any new evidence come to light, but with no officer thereafter assigned to pursue it as an active inquiry. No new evidence of the kind that might have reopened the case is recorded as having emerged in the years that followed its closure. The account of Annie Yates's death that survives today does so chiefly because of the digitisation, in more recent decades, of the newspaper archives in which the case was originally reported. Publications that carried notice of the discovery at Burton Crescent, the police description of the man from Euston Road, and the outcome of the inquest were, for more than a century, accessible only to researchers willing to search bound volumes or microfilm reels held within libraries and archives, a process that placed a case of this kind, lacking the sustained notoriety of others from the same period, well beyond the reach of casual inquiry. It was only with the broader digitisation of 19th century British newspapers and their availability through searchable archives that accounts such as this one became practicable to assemble in any detail, drawing together reports that had, for more than 100 years, remained scattered and effectively inaccessible outside specialist collections. This manner of rediscovery, common to a great many cases of this period that lack a dedicated modern study, accounts for the shape of the record as it exists today, thorough as to the newspaper coverage contemporary with the case itself, and silent as to nearly everything that lay outside the narrow window of press attention the case received in March of 1884. The garden at the centre of what is now Cartwright Gardens, laid out within the Crescent's original design and maintained across the intervening century and more, continues to occupy the same ground it did when Annie Yates took her room at number 12 in February of 1884. The Crescent's curve and the general proportions of its terraced houses remain recognisable from the form the street held at the time of her death, even as the interiors of the individual houses have been altered many times over in the course of their subsequent uses, first as lodgings of the kind Annie Yates had known, and later as accommodations serving the university and its students. No feature of the street as it exists today marks the particular house, the particular room, or the particular night with which this account has been concerned, and a visitor walking its length would find nothing to distinguish it from any other of Bloomsbury's surviving Georgian crescents. The two examining physicians, the two investigating inspectors, and the coroner before whom the inquest was convened, each performed the duties assigned to them under the procedures of the day, and each, in doing so, contributed to a record that, however incomplete in its account of Annie Yates's life, remains precise and consistent in its account of her death and of the state in which she was found. It is this record, procedural, dispassionate, and confined to what could be established through direct testimony and physical examination, upon which the whole of this account has depended, and it is this record, closed without resolution in 1884, that stands today as the only surviving account of what became of Annie Yates. The inquest itself proceeded according to the established practice of coroners' inquiries into sudden or violent death in this period, before a jury composed of local men summoned for the purpose, who were required, as a formal part of their duty, to view the body before hearing the evidence gathered by the investigating officers and the testimony of witnesses such as Annie Ellis. Such a jury was tasked with determining, upon the evidence presented to it, the cause and manner of death, and where a death was found to have resulted from violence at the hands of another person, it fell to the jury to determine whether that person could be named. Where the evidence permitted a name to be attached to responsibility for a death, a verdict of willful murder against that individual would ordinarily be returned, and the matter would proceed from the coroner's court toward committal for trial. Where the evidence, however clearly it established that murder had taken place, did not permit any individual to be identified with confidence, the customary verdict returned was one of willful murder by some person or persons unknown, a formal finding acknowledging that a crime had been committed while leaving the question of responsibility formally open. It was a verdict of this general character, consistent with a jury persuaded by the medical evidence that Annie Yates had been deliberately killed, but presented with no evidence sufficient to name any individual as her killer, that concluded the inquest into her death. This form of verdict, distinct from an acquittal or from any finding that no crime had occurred, left the case in a position from which it could, in principle, be reopened at any time should new evidence come to light naming a suspect, while placing no active obligation upon the investigating officers to continue a search that had already exhausted the leads available to them. It was the same category of verdict that had been returned 12 years earlier in the case of Harriet Boswell, and it would remain, so far as the surviving record establishes, the final formal word entered by any court or tribunal upon the death of Annie Yates, No later inquiry, no subsequent inquest, and no retrial of the question ever followed. The verdict returned in 1884 has stood, unrevised and unrevisited by any competent authority, for the entirety of the period since. Because her true identity was never established with confidence, the record does not establish whether any family member was ever traced or formally notified of Annie Yates's death, nor whether any relative came forward in the weeks following the inquest to claim her body or to confirm the name by which she should properly be remembered. Burial arrangements in cases of this kind, where no family could be identified or reached, ordinarily fell to the parish in which the death had occurred, though the surviving sources reviewed for this account do not specify where or under what name Annie Yates was ultimately laid to rest. This absence is, in itself, consistent with the wider pattern the record has already shown. A woman known to her neighbours by a name that may not have been her own, whose death was investigated, examined, and formally closed by the authorities of the day, without ever being fully reconciled with the life and the family she'd left behind before arriving at Burton Crescent 3 weeks before her death. The physical evidence gathered by Inspector Langrish and Inspector Blatchford, the towel recovered from the scene, the description of the missing purse and ring, and the notes taken from Annie Ellis and the other residents of the house would have been retained by the Metropolitan Force for a period following the inquest's conclusion, in keeping with the ordinary practice governing evidence connected to an unsolved case. No record has been located indicating that any of this material was drawn upon again in later years, whether in connection with a fresh suspect, a chance confession, or a renewed inquiry prompted by some later development. The trail, so far as any official record shows, went cold within the weeks following the inquest and remained cold thereafter. Its last documented activity, the closure of the file by the two inspectors who had pursued it as far as the evidence available to them allowed. Annie Yates's case was the last of these three examined here. The case file was closed without resolution. No suspect was charged. The record remained as it stood. Pub cure.